welcome Sara Barker, who's come down from Glasgow especially to talk to us in particular about a project that is on at the Baltic, which is in collaboration with Ryder Architecture, but then that will also broaden out to a more general discussion about recent practice and then maybe future projects as well. So what we're going to do is we're going to start with Sarah giving us a short presentation on the Baltic project, particularly because sort of assuming that most of you haven't seen it, and then we'll have our usual sort of question. We'll have a conversation, and then we'll open out to more questions. So
yeah, so maybe we can just click through sort of almost to the end of the images where the Baltic images start. So just after these ones, yeah, so just a couple back. Yeah, so maybe we can leave it there, and perhaps when I talk about Ryder Architecture, you can maybe just click through. There's about six, something like that.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so in the spring of last year, Emma Dean, who is here, curator at Baltic, invited me and Ryder Architects to come together to make a work for the newly refurbished level 2 gallery space at Baltic. And since Ryder aren't here to sort of explain their practice, I wanted to just slightly kind of flesh that out, talk a little bit about Ryder. I think I was paired with Ryder, although Emma can correct me if I'm wrong, because of the parallels that already existed within our practices. Founding partners of Ryder, Gordon Ryder and Peter Yates, were students of Lubetkin, kind of of particular interest to me because he was a peer of Paul Klee and Thomas Mann, a sort of big literary influence for me, and had worked with Corbusier in Paris, pioneers of the modernist movement. Sort of interestingly, with the Jane Drew exhibition on just now, she was supposedly also influenced by Lubetkin, although that's in some debate, I think, because she did go on to this more a kind of functional, everyday architectural vernacular in comparison. So those kind of recognisable aesthetics are elongated horizontals, a kind of economy of minimalist design, and a meeting of materials such as kind of white concrete and glass, which were already apparent in a kind of softer and smaller scale in my aesthetics and my practice. So over the next six months, our conversations together as collaborators sort of brought out these sympathies, and we worked together through drawings, a process of maquette making, and the eventual fabrication of the work by Glasgow-based Scott Associates, the Baltic team and myself coming to a head with the project in November last year. It was an opportunity to make a work of much greater ambition in lots of senses than I'd made before. So to make something almost of architectural scale, using the full height of the Baltic ceiling, which I think is about 8.5 metres, something like that. But I also felt like it was really important to me as an artist to keep the lightness of touch, slightness, kind of playfulness and freedom that is in my kind of collaging and painting and drawing process in the work, even on that scale. So the material didn't become so robust, there's a kind of fine line there. And to keep that kind of playful approach, it really happened in the maquette making. I think there is a picture of my maquette and you can see it's really not in its various incarnations along the kind of conversations. It was never a formal sort of architectural maquette. It was very much kind of me playing with metal, using tape, that kind of cut and paste thing on a three-dimensional model with picture glass and more kind of lightweight materials, so that sense of play and association and reference could be allowed to seep into the work, even to sort of stick to the surface of the work, so that I could be in control of those aspects. And I think the architects were really good in allowing me that freedom to do that, and then being able to input their sort of spatial concerns and scale concerns kind of within that process. So at that point, the sort of, you know, all of those influences, the architectural, painterly, literary influences, could be discussed and have a point to kind of become the work. So the eventual metalwork emerged quite anthropomorphically. The longest lengths of brass were allowed to slightly bow and sag under their own weight, giving the final form a sense of imbalanced, top-heavy improbability. So in this kind of organic composition, this organic way of making, things like the sort of motifs of cross-hatching, like drawing or music staves, could slot in like drawing into the work to play off the kind of the two-dimensional and three-dimensional interpretation of the work, and find a rhythm with the branching, more kind of fractal offshoots in the work. The glass and brass, you can see there, steel and painted aluminium elements were dependent on one another, the glass being a support to the metalwork, and the metalwork a kind of scaffold for the glass. And you can, through these kind of transparent veils, you can see the glass kind of creating volumes, compressing the work to a series of images, which is something that's kind of always important in my work, this kind of conflation between image and object, this line between the way you perceive the work. So compressing the view to a series of images, it reflects and fragmented the form, you know, in a sense as well, for me, relating back to this kind of cubist fragmentation that's been in my work before. So there's a sense of there or not in this kind of liminal space of disorientating transparency of the glass. There's, you know, our experience shifts, I think, with moving around any three-dimensional object. You know, I think that's why I make sculptures, really, to be surprised by them, even though I kind of start with this more painterly process. And particularly with the glass, you have this interior and exterior world being experienced at the same time. So in that sense, for me, bringing us back to an idea that's been prevalent in my work for a long time, which is a kind of notional idea, a sort of metaphor of the room and the boundaries of the room, that I often draw upon and, you know, perhaps expand on later. But with these sort of thresholds, the linearity of the metalwork, the veils of glass, I wanted to find a title for the work that drew on a kind of mythology. Jeanette Winterson writes really nicely about thresholds, in that to cross in and out is to enter different worlds, and that transgression of our private coordinates allows for a sort of shift in our assumptions that can be paradigmatic and lasting. So the title itself is The Subtle Knife, and taken from the second novel in Pullman's trilogy, His Dark Materials. and it talks about a knife so sharp that it can separate the membranes between one world and another. It is really quite beautiful descriptions of these bruised purples and sea blues, and that kind of sort of poetic description of colour often can kind of guide the work for me. That kind of painterly starting point. Yeah, so what is left of the painting is almost like these kind of slivers of aluminium material, painted with gouache and acrylic, and always a combination of materials, acted or maybe suggestive of the colour and composition of that other world, or if that's too much to ask of it, that it's sort of like a kind of opening a crack in a door, you know, kind of a glimpse of something, a kind of, I suppose through that kind of editing process of the painting, just to leave this small, suggestive, most poignant part of the painting. And through that colour and mark making, always in my work, I feel that that's a way for me to add this kind of other layer of meaning, so that a more intimate sense of association can be kind of brought to the work, and like I say, kind of literally kind of stick to the surface of the work. So yeah, perhaps that's a place to leave it.
Yes, that's great. There's plenty to pick up on there, I think. I mean, I suppose it's interesting when people write about your work, and there's a constant discussion about, you know, the fact that it sits in a sort of liminal space, essentially, between, you know, I mean, it's often referred to as sort of spatial drawing, or obviously clearly, you know, sculpture, but then also has this very painterly feel, and as you just described, that's often a starting point for you. And then I suppose, as the first question, just wondered where the kind of, to bring in the kind of architectural collaboration, where that then pushed you in terms of this particular work, in terms of a direction that you hadn't been before, or what that really brought for you to the work. I mean, you touched upon it, but I think it'd be interesting, and also maybe just talk a bit more about, you know, the process of collaborating, because sometimes, you know, many artists found, you know, in different scenarios that the idea of it is great, but then, you know, the reality of it can, you know, can be quite tough, which can be useful sometimes, as well as, you know, in terms of, as I was, you know, thinking, maybe just sort of pushing you outside of thresholds, maybe.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think I was really nervous initially about the collaboration, because I felt like to kind of scale up the work I make and to make it architectural might instantly lose something, because I've never felt like my work was about architecture. If anything, it was a sort of biographical idea of space. It was much more about our need for our spaces to represent ourselves, or be extensions of ourselves, or, you know, the way I explored ideas of architecture were much more about that kind of interior world, inside us as much as inside space. So it was kind of immediately a concern, and I pretty much kind of, I think I made that quite obvious to Ryder as well, that I sort of needed to have control over the way elements of the sculpture came about in the maquette, that I'd be making the maquette, and, you know, that I'd need a lot of control over the way that it was fabricated, to work with people that I knew, and I could be involved in the fabrication, even though I wasn't physically constructing a lot of it, that I would be at Scott Associates, looking at the way fixings were made, seeing the way metal started to bow, being able to allow that to happen, and to trust those people so much that they would allow those things to happen. They would question whether or not to straighten that line, to fix that, you know, so it's to have this kind of softness and direct kind of humanness that I felt like was really important in my smaller scale sculptures. but then in raising that straight away with Ryder, they were extremely sensitive to that, and I think they felt like, because they'd kind of come to me for that kind of sensitivity to the material, I think that they'd seen, and maybe like an appreciation of a certain aesthetic, that they didn't want to kind of steer me away from that. They just wanted to make something more participatory, definitely, and that was a place for me to go, and that kind of opened up the work for me, and it was a great thing to be able to imagine jewellery like fixings, you know, these kind of precious brass elements that I've soldered and, you know, had kind of quite a quiet, intimate process on my own making, to then work with a team and really kind of blow those things up, seemed like an exciting possibility, and I really trusted in them as well to sort of direct that sense of scale. So it actually probably would have been kind of lighter in a way if the architects hadn't kind of said to me, no, it won't be impactful in the space, you need to kind of scale up the metal to a certain level, it needs to become you know, more like these kind of standard sizes of Victorian plumbing. And through those conversations felt significant to me, although for them it was kind of quite a pragmatic thing to sort of scale up in relation to architecture and what they knew held a space. But to me, those things were quite, I suppose I read them as sort of more symbolic or poetic. The idea of Victorian plumbing even felt like a really nice relationship, to be almost kind of remaking some kind of scaffold for that room. Sort of made sense to me in another way. And I think also the way that the maquette making happened as well was very provisional, really. It was, you know, like you mentioned at the beginning, that relationship to drawing, they allowed it to be very organic, so I could really draw with the metalwork, have those kind of repetitions, those sort of tactile and optical qualities that I love in drawing could be manifest in the maquette, even though we knew on a bigger scale we'd have to be more deliberate about our actions. And so when changes needed to be made, you know, I could resolder a bit, or re-tape a bit, or glue gun a bit, and it was a very tactile process that probably was, you know, quite atypical for them, working with very kind of clean parameters, and architectural models is really different to my maquettes.
And was it very much sort of responding to, I mean, the architecture of the Baltic and this room, as you say, is quite distinct with the high ceilings, and because the plinth seems to be, I mean, we'll look at some other examples of your work soon, but particularly the plinth, and I suppose that, as you say, having quite a clear presence in a room, you know, that has got quite strong architecture, is that, you know, that seems to be quite a significant shift in this work. Yeah.
So I think maybe if you flick either backwards or forwards, you maybe see where you can see the drawings of the plinths there, and then you can kind of see the layers of them there. And for me, because of the kind of lightness of the other materials, I felt like those contrasts of having some kind of substructure for the glass to sit on was important. I think for the architects, because they wanted the work really to be of the space instead of in the space, that was the kind of thing that I keep quoting from Peter Buchan, from Ryder. He wasn't so sure initially about us having a kind of plinth per se, which I understand. I mean, I think as a sculptor you're always questioning the function of that anyway, but I think when we started talking about those kind of material relationships and talking about ways that architects had used kind of platforms to elevate the work, and for me that was one of the crucial, it was, you know, it was quite a practical thing. I wanted to really scale the height of the room. We couldn't do it with the glass alone for, you know, practical budget, all sorts of reasons. So the metalwork would have to extend to the ceiling, the glass could go so far, and we needed kind of another level to kind of to bring it up and force you to look up. And out of those conversations, we talked a lot about Carlo Scarpa and the Olivetti staircase. So these big slabs of marble that are kind of very, there's a real kind of economy about the way they float in space that they almost feel impossible in the way they exist. And I think we just found real kind of common ground, and so it made real sense to sort of to make something. In the end, actually, they kind of fitted around the glass because we needed to get cherry pickers to get right up to the top of the metalwork. So the plinths, in a way, are kind of hugging the glass. They came in afterwards.
What's the plinth made of?
They're wood, so MDF are rendered with a kind of cement, plaster cement, jesmonite mix, so kind of hardy, but they have a sort of sheen that's quite marble-like. Baltic made a small kind of miniature version so children could touch it because they have that. Even when you're next to them, it's quite hard to see what they're made of. But they have a kind of weight about them that you wouldn't know they were hollow. And I quite like that ambiguity. I mean, I'm not really bothered if you think that they're solid or rendered, or the sort of material, the kind of volume of them, even with the space inside of them, seems, it's another volume kind of in space, and it seems sort of fitting in a way.
And I mean, maybe I'll start scrolling through some other images, because I think particularly what you've, what is so sort of extraordinary about your work, and you've still achieved with this piece, even though it's on a different, larger scale, is this sort of tautology almost between having a very strong physical presence and then just a lightness that's almost achieved through absence. If that sort of makes any sense, but it's sort of, which is very much related to the idea of spatial drawing, or sort of drawing in space, but essentially creating a three-dimensional object without volume. And I just wondered, and that is a characteristic that sort of runs right through your work. And I just wondered if you could, maybe that might lead us to, I don't really want to get bogged down on discipline, but maybe for you to talk a bit more about how your thinking really does encompass across, thinking of 3D, but also drawing, I've already mentioned, but then painting as well.
And particularly with this work, so this was the first outdoor piece I've made for Jupiter Artland, which is sort of Livingston, kind of near Edinburgh, and it's part of the Edinburgh Festival. And I think that sense of here or not here is kind of exaggerated even more with this piece, because with all the kind of layering of the ferns, this sort of hierarchy of materials kind of exaggerated, and the glass at certain points when you look at it kind of completely disappears, and the metal's just kind of this very light drawing in space, even though it's kind of actually a much heavier glass to sit outside. Somehow it has kind of a greater sort of sense of ephemerality, I think, and probably because it's so reflected as well, the glass kind of is really confusing and complicating the image of it, which I quite like. And and I suppose it is in the sense of a drawing in space. It's that kind of fluidity of drawing that I really like, and I suppose I use, although it's impossible, I think, to not kind of evoke figuration or architecture in space when you deal in 3 dimensions like this, and I really like sculpture's ability to do that. I sort of find it more useful to think of the work in terms of abstraction, to think of the things as in that sense that to be abstract means that, or is to be apart from something concrete, a concrete reality, so not to make a fiction in that sense. This work it was called Patterns, which I think is much related to the surface of the painting and actually the pattern of the foliage that it was emerged in when we were kind of trying to look for the spot. But also, like lots of my titles, it refers to a poem, an Amy Lowell poem, so an Imagist poet. And quite often I kind of am finding these literary parallels to and painterly references to a kind of visual fragmentation. So Imagist poetry, like Cubist painting, does that, has that ability to synthesize multiple perspectives, images to bring together kind of one singular vision thing, and it's sort of made up of these kind of sort of impulses, these sort of fragments, and I really like that in writing and lots of kind of modernist literature I look at, but particularly in Imagist poetry. So she was kind of a peer of Ezra Pound and these more well-known poets.
So what would come first, the sort of, you know, the reading or the sort of, or do you apply?
I think the reading usually has to be sort of simultaneous, otherwise it's quite hard to shoehorn a title in at any point, but it's definitely a sort of, I use that word witnessing because it's definitely a sort of having the kind of source material, having the energy of that or something, or the kind of crutch of that almost, I think, to drive the work forward, to feel like it's giving it meaning, and then at some point for those things to kind of come together. You kind of hope that it comes together, and it doesn't always, but sometimes the title comes later. It came later, definitely with the Baltic Work, because I sort of tried to find a title that related more to the science fiction interests of Ryder Architects and this kind of more male presence I felt in the work, strangely. But because this was only my work, I could pick, often I'm reading literature by women, and because it was my first kind of bigger scale metalwork welded outside, I really wanted it to feel in the title, or to have a reference that just I knew about at least, that was kind of overtly feminine. And Patterns is a poem that to me kind of describes it. It's a real kind of like female journey. It's a really beautiful poem. I think it goes kind of like, I'm rare pattern, I walk down garden paths. My clothes, my dress is richly figured and leaves a stain of pink and silver in the gravel, and there's this kind of really beautiful sort of journey to the sculpture, down a garden path, and those kind of pinks and silvers. It was almost that kind of suggestion of colour that I kind of needed almost as a sort of guide to creating this kind of sort of sense of like remembered colour. Often the colour I use is quite kind of faded, almost like I'm looking at a lot of kind of old textiles, things like a sort of faded Sonia Delaney print or something like that, and that sense of this kind of hazy swathe of colour, rather than a kind of deliberately sort of reference colour, kind of guides the work in some sense, but I mean it's never deliberate. It's always very open. So sometimes it's slightly hard to talk about that sort of sensibility in a way.
But in a way, that's because you touched upon it in terms of abstraction. So in a way, that sort of hinting at content, but in a quite oblique way. But then that, as I understand it, is maybe what sort of you're thinking about, you know, a particular text, or is what sort of informs the content, but in a very abstract way.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Can I just, whilst we're on titles, maybe you could say a bit more about, because the Subtle Knife and the Philip Pullman trilogy is pretty dark. And you know, particularly, well, it's in the tradition of almost you know, the dark side of fairy tales anyway.
Yeah.
But was there something about that in terms of that sort of darker side in this piece, or it's vaguely threatening?
Well, I suppose when you're dealing with huge shards of glass, there's a greater threat. I mean, not deliberately so, really. I think I wanted to have a title that felt open to our collaboration, and in conversation with men who were just kind of really interested, 8 Ryder architects really interested in science fiction, and these were where we could sort of find common interests, actually. So it was genuinely, these were where our conversations were. They certainly weren't about imagist poetry, and so it felt like a more genuine way to find a title, to be honest.
There's a shared sort of common ground.
And that idea of mythology and these sort of boundary lines and thresholds. In fact, even the title itself has been in my head for probably sort of a few years, anyway, 4 years since I was in Amsterdam. Somebody came into my studio and said that I was making these kind of more singular kind of frameworks, and they said it was like Pullman's subtle knife then, because it was like sort of entering into another world, because they really were like sort of doors. And so I suppose it's been kind of floating around my head since then, and it kind of just found a place. It landed exactly.
I mean, there is a kind of precariousness that is deliberate as well.
Yeah.
You know, when I've witnessed or been involved in installing your work, and you come in and you're sort of quite robustly sort of, and everyone else is a bit sort of scared to to touch it, and that's very much, I think, to do with the the relationship between having a strong holding the space, but then with just the lightest possible
maybe
touch.
If you flick back to the Mary show, there's another, just before these ones, there's a glass work. So that work, and there might be a better picture of it. Maybe that's the best picture of it. So that that almost is like a picture glass. It's only a couple of millimeters, that glass, and the metalwork is completely dependent on the glass. So there's just one hole in the glass to support the metalwork there. So it's really kind of pivoting on that point. There is a sort of sense of instability, and that piece is called All That Is Changeable.
All That Is Solid, Absorbed.
That's the name of the show. And then that piece is all that's, I think it's fluid, changeable and unpredictable. And it's that sort of sense of, that kind of, I like that glass. I think that's why I like glass as a material, because it has that sense of fluidity, and it means that if it does feel like the sculpture is kind of constantly in motion, and that you're kind of incorporated in the sculpture as well. My show that's coming up at Carly Gabera, I've called that When I Become a Shadow, it's a title taken from another book, but that sense of becoming a shadow of the work, sort of a consciousness of being kind of viewed and viewer, is kind of always in the work, I think, and so sort of going back to that kind of darkness you mentioned, with the kind of Pullman reference. I suppose there is sometimes, I don't know if I would say darkness, but there's a sort of narrative, a sort of psychological space where there's, I'm kind of trying to set up some sort of text or subtext or plot between these sort of pivots in the space, these kind of characters in the space, the sculptural objects.
I suppose it's about tension, isn't it? Which is often physical, in terms of the pieces are quite delicately positioned. But then that sort of offers a more psychological sense of tension as well. Exactly. And so these titles came from an Elish Shafak book, 40 Rules of Love, which, I mean, is fairly well known now. I'm probably pronouncing your name really badly, but it's kind of contemporary literature, which
that often draw upon, but it's the sort of mysticism in that I was also interested in that it talks a lot about this. The whole book is kind of based around kind of Sufist philosophy that the author has herself, and I just find it quite interesting in relation to my own process and this kind of emergence of ideas and forms within a really kind of unconscious, sometimes really organic process. So it's a way that I've thought about my process before, and she has quite beautiful descriptions, sort of accidental descriptions of material.
Should we talk about this piece? Because I wanted to ask you a little bit about your dialogue with historic artists. I mean, you mentioned architecture actually earlier. Scarpa and other architects that have influenced. But I mean, I was a co-curator of a show called Drawing the Century, which included your work in, which was at Tate Liverpool, which was very much looking at drawing across the 20th century. And that was very much sort of trying to put contemporary artists at times in conjunction with historic artists as well. And this piece is at the Hamburger Bahnhof, which I coincidentally but luckily saw earlier this week. And you're in a room with Cy Twombly, whose work is often referred to and described as occupying a liminal space. I think psychologically actually as much as sort of physically in terms of media. And I just wonder if you could say a little bit about maybe historic references. I mean, Gecko is another artist who comes to mind, a Venezuelan artist, I think, whose practice sort of was in the 1960s and did sort of very large immersive kind of drawings in space, essentially three-dimensional works, as well as works that she called three-dimensional drawings. But I just wondered if you wanted to say anything about.
And it's interesting because also at Leeds Art Gallery, when Drawing Sculpture was there, another show that sort of framed my work within spatial drawing, I suppose, and kind of going right back. So I would be one of the younger artists in the show. It's interesting for me as well to see it within that context because of how the work feels so different actually, which is reassuring, I think. I think that's what I felt definitely walking into Leeds Art Gallery. I felt like there's always a kind of question of relevance when you're making artwork, any kind of artwork, and I always feel that my way of coming to a spatial drawing that might bear relation to a drawing on canvas like Cy Twombly's, or a constructivist drawing, and even though these have been influences at various points, they fade in and out of importance for me, and I sort of feel like I kind of come at it from a different direction. I mean, I certainly come at spatial drawing from much more of a painterly perspective, and my kind of natural sort of knack is for painting on kind of bigger surfaces, and only afterwards, just in a quite kind of individual, idiosyncratic sort of cutting away, editing, leaving these sort of sculptural remnants behind. It's really that process do I kind of come about the work. It's very kind of backwards. I'm never sort of conceiving of a sculpture and then making it, and I'm never drawing it first. That provisionality of drawing, that kind of direct action, the thin veneer between me and it has to happen when I'm actually making sculpture.
Because you trained as a painter. I mean, you were in the painting department in Glasgow. So I wonder if, maybe talk a little bit more about how it sort of came out of painting, and that's still very much a starting point. But then it's almost, you're describing a process, whether it's physically or not. It's about kind of paring back, essentially.
I think I've always really loved painting, expressive painting, people like Helen Frankenthaler particularly, and probably they're a greater influence on what I do than a huge amount of sculptures, although, you know, of course I look at sculpture as well. And I just think, I find it easier to contextualise the work in terms of another media for a start. So I find it easier to think about painting and make sculpture, or drawing and make painting, or for myself, I don't know, I think it's maybe to do with that sense of being surprised by the work, not knowing exactly where the work's going, having the freedom to paint on a big surface and not being precious about it, maybe. And there's always that sense of that word editing and remnant. Those are really, they feel like really kind of sculptural words that I sort of relate to people like Richard Tuttle and stuff, who's really just kind of exhibiting that remnant. There's a paring back, and that probably relates quite strongly to somebody like Cy Twombly. So the Cy Twombly's are I don't know, I haven't seen that show yet. It's his very early works, a lot of white canvas.
Yeah, and then the very sort of very light mark making, essentially.
Yeah.
The early work, which it's much more drawing on canvas.
Yeah,
rather
exactly.
than the later sort of, you know, more clearly painting.
Yeah, and I really like that work and that sense of scribble and gesture, and it's that sort of repetitive action and that kind of honesty about the surface and fragility about his surfaces as well, actually, that I feel, you know, I didn't put that show together, but that's a really nice kind of harmony. I mean, a real privilege for me as well, to be in that context.
It's a good pairing, because again, underlying Twombly's work was often a reference to, you know, literature or and actually mythology as well.
Yeah,
so,
yeah.
So that's an interesting kind of connection as well. But then through, you know, really very much abstraction.
Yeah, exactly. And in later works, so after this show, so I sort of started to introduce these kind of black boards, which almost act like a kind of, or they should be after that, yeah. So in some of these works, they act as a kind of, they shift the way you see the space, and yeah, in relation to that conversation about Cy Twombly, I mean, they're clearly very different. They're probably further away from Cy Twombly than my sculptures would be, floor-based sculptures, but they play with the space in the way that some of his huge black canvases, scribbled canvases, or somebody like Paul Klee that I look at a lot, can really kind of play with your perception of depth of the space, sort of in the same way the glass does in some ways, just kind of shift your perception, flatten the work. Actually, I think that's what started happening, because I just played with paper at the start to kind of find a backdrop for the sculptures, and it immediately sort of took away the shadow, the dimensions of the thing, and just left this sparse drawing that just kind of was what it was. It was just a sort of set of lines, and almost bore more relation to some of those influences, like kind of Kandinsky and some of those painters that I even referenced in the Baltic Work in terms of the kind of palette of colour of Lionel Feininger, a peer of Klee and Kandinsky, so that these forms wouldn't necessarily have to reference or become figures or architecture. They could become purely these symbols somehow, motifs, and closer to the painterly influences in that way, and flattened in that way. So I guess it's somewhere that the work is the direction that the work's going in, is to be dealing with this pictorial space more, I suppose, these sort of slender shards of material that kind of hold the painted surface within the edges are being kind of expanded out in the work. I think maybe I'm finding a kind of frustration with that tight editing down to that, and a sort of need to explore that kind of painterly picture plane more.
Do you want to, I mean, before we sort of open up, maybe it's a good point if you want to say anything about the projects you're working on, because you've got an exhibition at the Glasgow Museum of Modern Art?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
I never, because everyone refers to it as GOMO, and then I was
yeah.
just trying to remember what that actually stood for. But that opens in June,
Yeah.
and then you've got a show in Berlin in June as well.
Yeah.
So maybe if you just said something about, maybe.
Yeah. So the GOMO show is called For Myself and Strangers, which is a way that Gertrude Stein, when she was writing, used to describe her writing in sort of trying to get across, I think, the difficulty with knowing how people perceive your work, or never really being able to predict the way that the work would be perceived, to leave the work open in that sense. And so she was also, in lots of senses, she was making work for herself. It felt like an interesting, it's really an open-ended title, and at this point in the exhibition, when I have to think of a title, and I want this kind of quite open, there will be a sense of narrative in this installation of objects, actually, which has kind of crept back into the work more latterly, but hopefully that'll still be quite open, but maybe does deal with this sense of sort of psychological space more. The gallery will be, it's kind of in the early stages of making, but it's all new work, and the gallery will be kind of quite restructured, because it's quite a strange sort of, although it's a really big space, it has a feeling of a kind of corridor space that you're kind of moving through, rather than ever feeling that you've kind of landed in. So it doesn't feel like there's an end point to kind of frame the work, which is always quite important for my work. Those white spaces, those kind of negative spaces around the work we're talking about, are always something I have to consider. They always finish the work in a way. So there's quite a big restructure in the gallery, hopefully, that will be happening for that show, and definitely the work in the studio now, although I don't know exactly which direction it will go, kind of operates on this more. There are pieces that are already more pictorial and draw upon that kind of more deliberately on that kind of cubist still life reference. And then the work opening at Gateshead earlier in June is some old and some new work, sort of reframed, and actually that kind of that influence of not only Carlo Scarpa but other architects who use those kind of modes of display. At that point, particularly in the 60s, when those kind of hierarchies between art and architecture were shifting, whether the art was the architecture of the space or a means of display. So I'm sort of using some of those things, those sort of seeds that came out of those Baltic conversations, to kind of restage a lot of what feel like kind of totemic figurative sculptures that have been made in the last sort of 12 months, and there'll be new wall-based works as well, and again kind of partial restructuring of the gallery with some of these kind of floating plinths that just change the heights of these kind of figurative presences in the space. So it's quite a nice way to work, actually, because it's quite, for me, I usually don't work in that way. It's more sort of, I rarely stand back from the work until much later when the show's been on for a while. It's very much kind of making it and finding patterns in the way that I display it, but to sort of have already understand what the work is, that some of it that already exists, and to be able to sort of think quite visually and spatially at a distance from it, and find a way to sort of stage that is really nice, because the title of that show, on that kind of note of becoming a shadow, is from an Anne Quinn book, Three. She died after probably a third or fourth novel, so she's not hugely well known, but she's sort of known as a kind of contemporary Virginia Woolf or somebody. And she writes, well, the novel Three is much more like a play, in that it's very sort of contrived, set up, staged conversations between characters, and that sort of sense of prop and staging is quite a nice sort of premise to approach the situation of the work anyway, and different for me. So that's what's happening
right. So busy.
Yeah.
Has anyone got any questions they'd like to ask?
Maybe covered everything. Yeah, she covered everything.
Covered a lot. I suppose I had one question, which I'm not sure whether it's interesting or not. But Glasgow is I mean, you're not from Glasgow, but you went to college there and you chosen to stay there, and it has got a particular tight scene, I suppose, in a way, in terms of, you know, artists living and working there, and whether you feel like, you know, just if there was anything you felt to say about the context of working there.
Yeah. I mean, like lots of people, I've tried to leave Glasgow and then ended up coming back again, because it's just really very possible to be an artist there. It's very affordable to get materials, it's easy to get support to make things. So for me, it's been the best city for me to make what I want to make. And that's the reason I stay there, really. Studio rent isn't as cheap, but to live, you know, like everywhere, like in Berlin, it'd be easier to live, you know, and work in the same space, or somehow they're not quite compatible, but I mean, it's not bad, you know, compared to here. I'm sure it's reasonable. And there's a really lively scene. I mean, people talk about the Glasgow miracle and all sorts, that give it really status. But I think it's a really supportive art scene. I think you can make mistakes there. You know, you can grow as an artist, and you can take risks, and the bigger risk would be to not take a risk, to put on a very flat show that wasn't pushing yourself, or that was so closed and considered that it was dead somehow. So I think because you've kind of got that quite close-knit peer group following what you do, maybe that's that can kind of push you on, and it's a sort of, it's an audience, you know, that you know and trust by and large.
Well, I think, yeah, it seems to be, I mean, it has that close peer network, but also discourse, you know, which is quite rare, I suppose, because usually once you leave college you sort of vanish a bit, you know, but there it still seems that there is, you know, circulation of ideas and discussion.
And I think if you do things there, you know, when I left college, I was on various committees of galleries, and founded Mary Mary as a project space, a gallery there, and you know, got involved in things, put on other people's shows, did very little of my own work for a long time, but those things get noticed there, you know, kind of put in the work and get to know the scene, and that's doable, where maybe that, I mean, that's my experience, you know, that I don't know whether that would be the same somewhere else, that you could kind of step, you know, get involved in everything, and I suppose there is that kind of underground's probably the wrong word for it now, it's not very underground anymore, but there's a sort of lots of low-key projects happening still, kind of relate to the music scene as well in Glasgow, that there's a real energy about the stuff that happens that's not in the bigger spaces, that's not in Goma, you know. It's just people putting things on that Mary was just in our flat when it first opened.
Great. Well, I think, unless anyone's... Sorry.
Fausto Melotti, you know his work perhaps?
I don't think so. Say again?
Fausto Melotti.
I don't know.
20th century.
Uh-huh.
Architect, sculptor, and music was where I was going to take that question.
Yeah.
You've mentioned literature, you've mentioned poetry, you've mentioned art, you've mentioned architecture.
Yeah.
Melotti, as a sculptor and as an architect, was very, very interested in music, which he thought was the most spatial art.
Yeah.
And was particularly concerned with the abstract nature of space and music. You haven't mentioned this at all. I wondered if it did influence your practice.
Yeah. I mean, maybe just through painting, it does in some sort of abstract sense. Not particularly. I mean, it's not a way into work for me, like somebody like Victoria Morton, contemporary painter that I love, and she really sees her work as kind of dancing, and those rhythms are important in my work, but I mean, I never apply it to kind of particular music. But talking about people like Kandinsky, who, like Victoria Morton, then, you know, a big influence for her, was so interested in those kind of rhythms, and in the Baltic Work, I did feel like those kind of cross-hashed sections did become like kind of musical staves. So I mean, I really like that parallel, but I suppose, you know, quite honestly, it isn't a departure point for me.
I think his work looks, on a first level, his work looks a lot different.
Yeah, I'll look him up, definitely.
Good. I feel like we should have a reading list to accompany this, which we could do. But thank you. That was really great to talk through. Some of the recent work and the amazing project that presenting at Baltic, and to hear something about what else is happening this year. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.